The night Meg Calloway walked into Bellini's, she had everything planned. The reservation, the table, the wine, the moment she would tell Oliver to leave. She had been planning dinners like this for 4 years, ever since planning became the only thing standing between her and grief. But halfway to the VIP table, she stopped. In the far corner, a man in a wrinkled shirt sat hunched over a menu, reading it aloud to a little girl in a yellow dress. Slowly, word by word, like it was the most important thing in the world. Meg's chest tightened. Because it was. 4 years ago, Meg Calloway had been a different kind of woman. Not softer, exactly, she had never been soft, but more present. She used to laugh at dinner. She used to let Richard pour her a second glass of wine without checking her phone. She used to watch Oliver sleep and feel something uncomplicated, something that didn't require management or a contingency plan. Then Richard died on a Tuesday morning in March, quietly, in a hospital room she had not reached in time, and the woman who laughed at dinner quietly disappeared. What replaced her was efficient and capable, and never late for a meeting. What replaced her kept Oliver's schedule so full that neither of them had time to sit with the silence. Violin on Mondays, Mandarin on Tuesdays and Thursdays, robotics camp every other weekend, a chess tutor on Friday afternoons, which Oliver endured with the patience of a child who had decided that patience was safer than complaint. Meg had built it carefully, the way she built everything, with precision, with purpose, with the conviction that a well-constructed life was a protected one. She told herself it was opportunity. She told herself Richard would have wanted this. She did not let herself think about the other thing, the real thing, that a 10-year-old boy had a habit of standing in the hallway outside her home office and pressing his palm flat against the door. Not knocking, just standing there, like someone waiting for a light to change. She had noticed. She had not opened the door. Oliver was quiet in the car on the way over. He sat beside her with his violin case between his knees and his face turned toward the window, watching the city slide past like he was looking for something he'd misplaced. Meg had asked about school. He had said fine. She had asked about robotics. He had said fine. She had run out of questions somewhere around Michigan Avenue, and they rode the last 4 blocks in silence. She told herself that was fine too. She was getting good at fine. Bellini's was warm and crowded and smelled like garlic and good wine. The host recognized Meg immediately and moved toward her with the particular deference reserved for people whose names appeared on donor walls. Oliver followed a half-step behind, tugging lightly at his collar. He hated ties. Meg had told him he would wear one anyway. The restaurant hummed around them, crystal and conversation, and the low percussion of a Friday night in a room that cost too much, and Meg moved through it the way she moved through most things. Efficiently, without apparent effort, with everything already decided. She had the table number memorized. She had the wine already selected, a Barolo she had been saving the occasion for since Tuesday. She had built this evening, as she built most things, from the outside in, beginning with logistics and working inward only as far as necessary. What she had not built and could not build was a conversation. She had tried, in the car. She had asked Oliver about his week, and he had said fine. She had asked about the robotics project, and he had said it was going okay. She had asked whether he was looking forward to dinner, and he had looked at her with those serious dark eyes and said yes, Mom. In the tone of a child who has learned to give the expected answer. She had run out of questions somewhere around the river, and they had ridden the last several blocks in a silence that neither of them remarked on, because they had both gotten very good at not remarking on things. They were almost to the VIP table when she saw them. The man was in the far corner. At one of the small tables near the back wall, the ones Bellini's kept for walk-ins and overflow, half hidden behind a structural column. He was wearing a blue Oxford shirt that had been ironed at some point but had since lost the argument. His shoes were dark and clean but worn at the heels in a way that suggested a long acquaintance with hard floors. He was leaning forward over an open menu, and sitting across from him was a little girl in a yellow dress with 2 uneven pigtails, watching her father's face the way children watch faces when they are completely safe. He was reading her the menu, not scanning it, reading it, running his finger along each line, sounding out the Italian names carefully, pausing to explain. The girl giggled at something, covered her mouth with both hands, and Meg heard the man laugh too low and unhurried, the laugh of someone with nowhere else to be. Meg stopped walking. Oliver bumped gently into her from behind. "Mom, our table." She didn't move. She stood there in the middle of the restaurant with $60 worth of dry-cleaned blazer and a reservation she had held for 3 weeks, watching a man in a wrinkled shirt read a menu to his daughter like it was a bedtime story. Something in her chest pulled toward it in a way she didn't entirely know what to do with. Then the host was at her elbow, and she followed and sat down. But she kept watching the corner. The waiter assigned to the back section, a young man with the practiced indifference of someone who categorized tables by their probable tip, approached the corner with a notepad and an expression that had already made its judgment. He looked at the man's shirt. He looked at the girl's mismatched pigtails. Something shifted in his posture, some small, unconscious decision. He leaned down and said something Meg couldn't hear across the room. Whatever it was, it made the man nod slowly. The waiter wrote nothing down, turned, and walked away toward the kitchen without leaving menus, without offering water, without doing any of the 10 routine things that were his job to do. The man watched him go. Then he looked at his daughter, who had been watching too, and he said something low that made her look up at him. Whatever he said, she accepted it. She nodded seriously, the way children nod when they trust that the person explaining things to them is telling the truth, and she went back to looking at the menu. And the man didn't call after him. He didn't raise his hand or do any of the things Meg would have done without thinking. He just turned back to his daughter and started telling what appeared to be a very involved story involving large hand gestures and exaggerated facial expressions. The girl leaned forward on her elbows and watched him like he was the most interesting thing she had ever been in a room with. 10 minutes passed. The waiter did not return. She knew Bellini's better than most people in this room because Callaway Group held a minority stake in the parent hospitality company. A quiet investment, the kind that didn't appear in press releases. She knew the general manager's name. She knew the kitchen maintained specialty dietary inventory as a matter of standard policy. She set down her wine glass, told Oliver she'd be right back, and crossed the restaurant to find Patrick, the general manager, near the host stand. She told him what she'd observed and what she knew about the kitchen's inventory. She wanted a full allergen-accommodating menu brought to the corner table, and whatever that family ordered charged to her corporate account, no name given, no explanation offered. Patrick said, of course, Miss Callaway, and moved toward the kitchen. Meg walked back to her table and sat down. She picked up her wine glass and took a sip and looked at the menu as though she had been reading it the whole time. Oliver was not looking out the window. He was looking at her. She raised her eyebrows in the way that meant, "What is it?" He opened his mouth, seemed to reconsider, and looked back down at his bread roll. He picked it apart slowly with both hands, the way he did when he was thinking about something, but the corner of his mouth had moved, just slightly, just enough to mean something she hadn't seen from him in a while. When the waiter returned to the corner table, he was carrying a leather-bound menu and an expression that had been significantly recalibrated. Daniel Pruitt looked up from the story he'd been telling Rosie, something involving a cat, a busted radiator, and a 14th-floor apartment he'd been painting last winter, and felt the shift in tone before he understood the cause. "Our apologies, sir," the waiter said. "The kitchen is fully prepared to accommodate your daughter's dietary needs this evening. May I offer you our complete gluten-free menu?" Daniel looked at him steadily. "I thought you said you didn't have one. We apologize for the miscommunication. It was an error on our part." He set the menu down carefully, filled their water glasses with the attentiveness of someone whose instructions had been updated, and stepped back. After he left, Daniel sat with the menu in his hands for a moment, turning it the way you turn something you're not entirely sure you should trust. He looked toward the kitchen. He looked toward the host stand. He looked around the restaurant with the methodical attention of a man who had been surprised enough times to take surprises seriously. "Daddy." Rosie's voice dropped to the register she used for important information. "That lady over there, the one in the dark jacket, I think she did something." Daniel followed her gaze. Across the room, at a table with white linens, a woman in a dark blazer was cutting food for a boy about Rosie's age. Her back was mostly toward them. She was not looking their way. "You don't know that, Bug." "I think I do." Rosie said it with the settled certainty of a 7-year-old who has decided. She looked at us before she got up, like she was making up her mind about something. Daniel watched the woman for another moment. She gave nothing away. He turned back to the menu. "Let's just order." "What sounds good?" "Gnocchi," Rosie said immediately, without opening the menu. "You said little potato dumplings." "I like dumplings." "Fair enough." The gnocchi came with a cream sauce on one side of the menu and a tomato sauce on the other, and this required a proper conversation, which they had. It was, while Daniel was helping Rosie weigh the relative merits of each, that the boy at the woman's table looked up and turned toward them. He was maybe 10, with dark hair and a blue tie he'd loosened and then apparently tried to straighten without a mirror, the collar slightly off-center in the particular way of self-corrections made in the absence of feedback. He had the watchful expression of a child who had spent most of his life in adult spaces. Rosie waved at him. Both hands, above the table, the unreserved wave of someone who hasn't yet decided that wanting to be friendly is something to manage. The boy went still. Meg saw it from across the restaurant. Her hand stopped above her plate, and she watched Oliver receive that wave with an expression that looked, from this distance, like someone being handed something they hadn't expected and weren't sure what to do with. Oliver's world was instructors and tutors and the carefully selected children of her colleagues. Kids who attended events and shook hands. Not kids who waved across crowded restaurants at strangers they'd never met. Oliver lifted his hand and waved back. Slowly, carefully, like something he was learning the mechanics of for the first time. Meg looked down at her plate. She did not look at Oliver, because if she did, something might show on her face she wasn't ready for. But she was smiling. She felt it start the way you feel things you weren't planning on from somewhere below the deliberate, unstoppable before you can manage it. Oliver ate about half his linguine, set down his fork, and asked, with the careful phrasing of someone who has practiced the sentence, whether he could go over and talk to the girl for a few minutes. Meg said they didn't know those people. He said she had waved at him. She looked at him, those serious dark eyes that had always been older than the rest of his face, the unspoken question behind them that she had been unable to answer for 4 years. She thought about his hand against the hallway door. She thought about the word fine, said 4 different times in one car, meaning something different each time. She thought about the lopsided grin she hadn't seen in longer than she could comfortably calculate. She thought about what Daniel had said about growing up through it, instead of despite it. "Fine," she said. A few minutes. Oliver crossed the restaurant with the careful walk of a child determined to look like he wasn't nervous. He stopped at the edge of the corner table and said hello. Rosie immediately slid the crayons across the table. She had produced a small collection of them from somewhere. Daniel had learned not to ask and showed him the drawing she'd been working on. "I'm building a dragon," Rosie said. "His name is Gerald, but I can't get the bicycle right." "The dragon has a bicycle?" "He's an architect. He needs to get to work somehow." "That makes sense," Oliver said, and sat down. He picked up a crayon and began sketching what appeared to be a structurally sound bicycle frame. Within 4 minutes, his tie was fully loosened, and he was laughing at something Rosie had just added to Gerald's outfit. A bow tie, rendered in purple, on the grounds that architects always wore bow ties in Rosie's considered opinion. Oliver said he had never actually met an architect. Rosie said she hadn't either, but it still seemed right. Oliver said that was fair. They proceeded from there. Daniel watched them the way parents watch children who are being exactly who they should be, with the particular relief that comes from seeing something you've been hoping for arrive without being forced. Oliver had lost the careful adult space posture entirely. He was sitting sideways in the chair, leaning on both elbows, giving Rosie's dragon architecture lecture the full quality of his attention, the way he normally reserved for things he'd decided to take seriously. Rosie was not performing for him. She was just being Rosie, which was apparently exactly what was required. What Daniel had noticed about Rosie, in 7 years of watching her navigate the world, was that she had a particular gift for meeting people exactly where they were. She didn't adjust herself, for Oliver didn't simplify, didn't perform, didn't try to be interesting. She just showed him Gerald the architectural dragon and the problem of the bicycle and her considered opinions about professional dress codes, and Oliver, who had apparently never been offered anything so straightforward, walked right through the door she had left open. It was the best thing Daniel had seen all week. It was also, if he was being honest with himself, the best thing he had seen in considerably longer than that. Then Daniel looked across the restaurant and found the woman in the dark blazer watching too. Her wine glass was in her hand, but she wasn't drinking. She was watching her son sit sideways in a restaurant chair in a loosened tie, laughing at a purple bow tie drawn on a fictional dragon, and her eyes had a quality that Daniel recognized without being able to name it. He had worn it himself every morning for a year, after Claire died, the look of someone watching something they have lost and found simultaneously, the look of a person whose grief and their hope have shown up in the same moment. He looked back at the children. He thought, that kid needs this. He thought, so does his mother. He thought, none of that is your business. He looked down at his gnocchi and gave it the attention it deserved, which was considerable, and tried to think about something else. He managed it for approximately 3 minutes. Then he folded his napkin, stood up, and walked across the restaurant. He stopped at her table. He said he wanted to thank her. He had figured it out. Rosie was rarely wrong about these things, and he said it plainly, without setup or qualification. The woman looked up. She had gray eyes and a face that was composed in the way of someone who had spent years making composure into a reflex. "Don't mention it," she said. Her voice had the practiced finality of someone who knew how to close a subject. Daniel didn't sit down. He didn't leave either. He stood there for a moment, looking at her plate, at the risotto cooling at the edges of the bowl, untouched. Then he said, "My wife used to order that every Friday. She said it tasted like the end of a good week." The woman's fork stopped moving. She looked up at him, not the cautious, managed glance from a moment ago, but fully, with those gray eyes open all the way. He saw the moment she understood what he had just said. Not the words, the place the words came from. Neither of them said anything. The restaurant continued around them, conversation and cutlery, and the low hum of a Friday night full of people who had nowhere particular to be, and they stood in a silence that wasn't uncomfortable. It was the silence of two people who have just recognized something in each other that they each thought was particular to themselves. From the corner table, Rosie's voice rose briefly and clearly above the general noise. "I only have a dad. Mom's in heaven." Daniel turned. Oliver had asked something head down, voice low, the kind of question you ask when you've been carrying it for a while. Rosie answered without hesitation, with the calm directness of a child who has lived with a hard thing long enough to have accepted it. "Do you have a dad?" Rosie asked. Oliver was quiet for a longer moment. Then, "I only have a mom." Rosie looked at him. Then she slid the drawing paper across the table and held out a brown crayon. "Then draw with me." Oliver took the crayon. Meg was looking at the tabletop when she said it. "Sit down," she said. Her voice came out quieter than she'd intended, less composed. "If you want to, you don't have to stand." Daniel pulled out the empty chair across from her and sat. He told her his name. She told him hers, just Meg, she said, without the rest of it, which was unusual enough that she noticed herself doing it. He didn't ask for the rest. He didn't ask what she did or any of the things people ask when they recognize they are talking to someone who mattered in a way that could be useful. He accepted what she'd offered and moved on. He talked about Rosie, the celiac diagnosis, and the year it took to understand what that meant in practical terms. The label reading that had become second nature, the restaurants that said they could accommodate, and turned out to mean they weren't sure. He talked about painting houses, about how the hours were his own, and that mattered more than he had expected it to when he first took it on. He talked about Rosie the way a person talks about the thing their entire life has reorganized around, not with the weight of sacrifice, not with any performance of difficulty, but with the simple clarity of someone who has accepted a particular arrangement and found it, on balance, the right one. He talked the way people talk when they have stopped expecting to be impressive. Simply, without architecture. Without the careful presentation of a self that is managing its own impression. Meg found herself listening in a way she hadn't listened to anyone in longer than she could account for. Not assessing, not planning her next sentence, not managing the pace of the conversation, just listening. It turned out to feel different from what she had been doing in conference rooms. "Doesn't it exhaust you?" she asked. She hadn't meant to say it aloud. Daniel looked toward the corner table. Rosie was demonstrating the art of the napkin crane to Oliver, holding it up, shaking her head at his attempt, demonstrating again with the unhurried patience of someone who finds teaching genuinely interesting rather than merely necessary. "Some nights," Daniel said. "Some nights it does." He paused, watching Rosie rearrange Oliver's hands around the napkin. "But then I watch her, and I think, she's not growing up despite everything. She's growing up through it." A shorter pause. "And so am I." Meg turned away. She looked toward the window, the dark glass, the soft blur of Michigan Avenue behind it, the city going about its business outside, and let the word settle somewhere she didn't usually let things settle. She had filled Oliver's schedule because she told herself it was for him, because opportunity was what Richard would have wanted, because an empty afternoon was an afternoon that could have been used for something. She had told herself all of those things carefully and consistently, and she believed some of them. But sitting here now, she heard Daniel say she's growing up through it and felt the other thing surface, the thing that she had been managing very successfully not to think about directly. She had filled Oliver's days because empty days had space in them, and space meant silence. And silence sounded too much like a house where someone used to be. "He used to laugh more," she said finally. She hadn't planned to say it. The whole body kind, the kind where he couldn't hold himself upright. Oliver had apparently achieved some version of a crane, because Rosie was clapping and Oliver was grinning the wide, open, lopsided grin she hadn't seen in longer than she could comfortably calculate. "I've been protecting him," she said quietly. "I think maybe from the wrong things." Daniel didn't rush to fill the space after that. He watched Oliver and Rosie with the unhurried attention of someone who understood that whatever was happening at that table deserved not to be interrupted. Then he said, "When you can't fix the big thing, you fix everything else. You build the schedule and fill the calendar and tell yourself that's the same as being there." He looked at her directly. "It isn't, but it's a very easy mistake to make and a very hard one to stop making once you've started." Meg said nothing. There wasn't much to usefully say to that. She looked at her plate. She looked at his hands around his water glass, the knuckles slightly rough, the hands of someone who worked with them, who knew what things were made of from the inside, and she thought about the way he'd talked about Rosie, not as a burden or a purpose or an obligation he had accepted, but as the simple, fixed point that everything else navigated around. The way sailors used to navigate by a single star, not because it was the only star, but because it was the reliable one. She thought about Oliver standing in the hallway. She thought about the word fine, said 4 times in one car ride, meaning something different and sadder each time. She thought about the schedule she had built and what it had actually been for, and she thought about Daniel saying it takes a while to figure that out, and she thought, "I have been very slow." "What was her name?" Meg asked. Your wife? Claire, he said. How long ago? 2 years. Car accident. February. Meg nodded. Richard. 4 years. March. They sat with that for a moment, the 2 months, the 2 names, the arithmetic of it, and then Daniel said, quietly, February and March are rough months to lose somebody. Yes, Meg said. They are. The evening moved on after that. At some point, a second bottle of water appeared at the table without anyone ordering it. Rosie and Oliver ran out of paper and moved to the placemats, and the waiter said nothing. The restaurant thinned out gradually around them, table by table, until the far end of the room was empty and the staff were moving chairs. Outside, Chicago was doing what Chicago does. Inside, the particular warmth of the corner held. Eventually, Daniel signaled for the check. The waiter brought it in a small leather folder, set it on the table, and stepped back. Daniel opened it. Inside was a card, cream-colored, small. 3 words and a dash. Taken care of. A friend. He looked up. Across the restaurant, Meg was standing, pulling on her coat with the efficient movements of someone who has somewhere to be next. Oliver was beside her. Violin case back in his hands, tie reinstated with the imperfect symmetry of a 10-year-old who had retied it himself. Daniel stood. He said one word to Rosie, wait, and crossed the restaurant. She saw him coming and stopped at the door. He stopped a few feet from her. He held up the card. I can't let you do this. Meg tilted her head, a small, composed movement. It wasn't a large gesture. I know what size it was, that's not the point. He looked past her briefly toward the corner table, where Rosie was watching them with the transparent attention of a 7-year-old who has decided this is important. My daughter is watching. She needs to see that when someone does something kind for you, you return it. That's not optional. That's not something you grow out of because you can afford not to. He reached into his jacket and produced a white envelope. Folded once. It's the exact amount. My number is in there too, because that's how this started. You made a call. I should at least be reachable. Meg looked at the envelope. She looked at his face. She looked at her son. Oliver was standing in the careful, attentive posture he used in most adult situations. Watching Daniel, with an expression Meg couldn't quite read, the quiet, slightly older than 10 look he got sometimes, the one that had always been a half step ahead of what she expected from him. He looked at Daniel. He looked at his mother. Mom, Oliver said. He's right. 3 words. Even. Unhurried. Without insistence or drama. Said by a boy who had spent an evening drawing dragons with a stranger and watching a man return a kindness he hadn't asked for, and who had arrived by the direct, uncomplicating route that children take when no one has taught them yet to make the obvious complicated at the only conclusion available. He wasn't correcting his mother. He wasn't testing Daniel. He was just saying the thing that was true, in the way that children say true things. Simply, without preamble, without softening, because it had not yet occurred to him that truth was something you were supposed to manage. Just a 10-year-old boy who had spent an evening drawing dragons with a stranger and learning something, without anyone teaching it to him, about what it looked like when a person returned what they'd been given. He had arrived at the obvious conclusion by the direct route that children take when no one has taught them yet to make it complicated. Meg looked at her son for a moment. Then she looked at the envelope in Daniel's hand. She took it. Thank you, she said. For the conversation. Same, he said. She turned and walked out. Oliver followed. At the corner table, Rosie slid her small hand into her father's. Did she take it? Rosie asked. She took it. Rosie considered this with the thorough deliberation she applied to most things. Good, she said finally. She seemed nice. Once she stopped being fancy, she paused again. Gerald would have liked her. Daniel looked down at her. The dragon. He's an architect. He likes people who do things without explaining why. Daniel laughed the full, unhurried kind and pulled her close with one arm. He looked across the restaurant toward the door, which had already closed behind Meg and Oliver. He stood there for a moment in the warm, thinning restaurant, his daughter tucked against his side, the dinner mostly finished, the evening at its natural end. He felt something that was not quite peace and not quite possibility, but was somewhere in the neighborhood of both the particular quality of a night that has been better than you expected and left you with more than you arrived with. "Come on, Bug," he said. "Let's go home." Meg didn't sleep. She sat at the desk in her home office with her laptop open to Oliver's calendar. The same desk he stood outside. The same door she'd never opened. The screen showed the next 3 weeks. Violin at 7 in the morning, Mandarin at 9, robotics filling both days of each coming weekend, chess on Friday afternoons, the whole architecture of a life she had built to leave no gaps. She looked at it for a long time. Then she started deleting. Saturday first, working methodically forward. Then Sunday. Then the Saturday after that, and the one after, clearing the white space back into the grid the way you clear a table you are preparing to use for something else. By the time she stopped, both weekend days for the next month were empty. She sat with it for a moment, the particular blankness of a calendar that has been emptied on purpose. White space returned to itself. It looked like nothing. It also looked, unexpectedly, like room. Like the kind of space you don't know you need until you've made it, and then wonder how you went so long without it. She took the envelope from her coat pocket and unfolded it. A square of paper with a phone number in plain, unhurried handwriting, the handwriting of someone not trying to make an impression with it. She opened a new message on her phone. Typed, "My son wants to know if Rosie would like to go to Millennium Park tomorrow. No agenda, just kids." Read it back twice. It sounded like what it was, a message written by someone who was trying to make something sound casual that wasn't entirely casual, and she left it anyway. Added, after a pause she didn't enjoy, "I owe you a proper thank you. You reminded me of something I forgot I'd lost." She sat with that sentence for a moment. It was more honest than she usually allowed herself to be in writing, in any writing, because written things stayed, and stayed things tended to be held against you. She sent it before she could revise it a 5th time, set the phone face down on the desk, sat in the quiet for a moment, in the office she had made into a fortress against exactly this kind of feeling, in the house that had been too silent for 4 years. The silence was the same as it always was. Something in her was different. Across town, Daniel's phone lit up on the kitchen counter at 11:57. He was still awake. He was usually still awake at this hour, had been since February 2 years ago, since the particular kind of sleeplessness that follows a loss and becomes, gradually and then suddenly, simply the shape of your nights. He had read Rosie 3 chapters of her book. He had cleaned the kitchen. He had stood at the window for a while, looking at the street below, the familiar geometry of the neighborhood at midnight. He had been thinking about a woman who ordered risotto and didn't eat it. He had been thinking about her son, who had needed someone to wave at him across a restaurant before he remembered how to wave back. He read the message once. He stood for a moment at the counter with the phone in his hand, and the kitchen dark around him and Rosie asleep down the hall, her nightlight making a soft amber line under the door. He thought about the message, the revision in it, the 3 attempts he could feel in its careful phrasing. The second message sent a minute after the first that said something real and had been edited too. He typed, "We'll be there at 10, set the phone face down on the counter, stood in the quiet kitchen for another moment, listening to the city outside the particular sound of Chicago at midnight, which was not silence but a kind of organized, quiet, the sound of a city that has reached a temporary agreement with the dark, and to the refrigerator's hum and the distant, barely audible sound of Rosie breathing down the hall. He thought about the evening. He thought about a boy who needed someone to wave at him before he remembered how to wave back. He thought about a woman who deleted a schedule at midnight and sent a message before she could revise it a 5th time. He thought these were not small things. Then he went to bed. He was asleep before midnight. It had been a while since that had happened, and he noticed. The morning was clear and cold in the particular way of early November in Chicago, the kind of cold that is serious about itself, that gets into the gaps between your collar and your coat before you've finished crossing the first block. The sky above Millennium Park was pale blue and entirely without clouds, and the light came down flat and clean across the plaza, the kind of light that makes things look like they're at the beginning of something. Oliver saw Rosie from across the open space and started moving faster without appearing to decide to. Rosie saw him and raised both hands above her head, the same wave as the restaurant, fully committed, no reservations about it, and Oliver lifted one hand and waved back, and this time there was nothing tentative about it. They ran toward Cloudgate the way children run toward things that don't require an explanation because it was large and silver and strange, and the ground in front of it was wide and open, and there was no reason not to run. Meg and Daniel walked. They fell into step without discussing it, and Meg kept her hands in her coat pockets and watched the children's reflections appear and multiply in the silver surface ahead. "You know," Daniel said, "I still don't know your last name." "Calloway," Meg said. He looked at her. She waited for the familiar recalibration, the shift that happened whenever someone understood the full context of who she was. It didn't come. He nodded once, the way you nod at information that updates your picture but doesn't change the main thing. "Just Meg is fine," she said. "Okay. Just Meg." They found a bench and sat. The children were circling Cloudgate, stopping to examine their reflections, moving around the curve, stopping again. Oliver had his head tipped back, watching the distorted skyline arc overhead in the silver surface. Rosie was explaining something with the particular seriousness she brought to things she considered important, and Oliver was nodding with the attentive expression he gave things he had decided deserved it. Meg watched him for a moment without saying anything. It occurred to her that she had been watching Oliver perform competence for 4 years, performing it for his tutors, for her colleagues, for the careful, structured world she had built around him, and she had forgotten that this, the sideways leaning, the genuine listening, the laugh that carried across open plazas in cold November air, was also him. Was more him, maybe, than any of it. "He looks different," she said, after a while. "Yeah, not his clothes. His face. He looks like himself. I forgot what that looked like." Daniel didn't fill the silence. She appreciated it more than she could say. Oliver spotted her and waved easier now, without the hesitation from the night before, then grabbed Rosie's hand and crouched to show her something at a low angle on the surface. They both crouched. Oliver laughed the whole body kind, carrying across the open plaza. He came back at a run, cheeks red. Completely himself. "Mom, come look. There's an angle where you look like a giant." "Come on." He held out his hand. Meg stood. She took his hand and let him lead her toward the sculpture, toward Rosie already waving, toward the curved silver mirror and the November sky reflected in it. Daniel followed. The 4 of them stood in front of Cloudgate and looked at what came back. 4 reflections, stretched and bent and overlapping. The cold light scattered in the steel into something almost warm. Meg looked at Oliver's hand in hers. She looked at this morning, unscheduled, unplanned, not on any list she had ever made. She let herself be there. It was the smallest thing she had done in years. It was the largest.